During the Great War, the Western Front became a place of legends, myths, heroism, and brutal death. In faraway France, the free world fought for its survival. Thousands of young Australians played their part in holding the line against the enemy. Sailing from our shores, young diggers did not know if they would ever see home again, did not know if they would return to loved ones and friends. Each and every one of those soldiers had love of home and country in their hearts, and a fierce determination to return to the land of their birth. It's October 1917. The Great War in Europe is into its fourth ferocious year. Young Australians are fighting and falling beside their allies in the war to end all wars against the Germans. Their thoughts are of king, country, survival, and their families back home. In that year, Elizabeth Morgan was a teenager in Melbourne. Her life and the lives of all her friends were dominated by the war. She was about to have a brief encounter, an encounter which would remain part of family folklore for more than 70 years.
Good night, Jack. It was something my mother told me many, many times throughout my life, and something that I never ever got tired of hearing, was when she was 18, 19, living at home with her parents in a very narrow street in Port Melbourne.
It's a story that Elizabeth Morgan's daughter, Pat, has passed down to her children and grandchildren. Pat's mother and her parents followed the war day by day, battle by battle. Her mother's sweetheart was fighting on the Western Front, and so was her close friend and neighbour, 19-year-old Jack Thomas.
Jack Thomas was a private in the 39th Battalion from Victoria, which was part of the 3rd Australian Division. That division launched one of the last Australian attacks on the village of Passchendaele on the 12th of October 1917.
Obviously, Peter Stanley, an historian at the War Memorial in Canberra, knows the details of the campaign in France and Belgium intimately. It was a campaign in which 500,000 Allies would lose their lives. Among them, 38,000 Australians. While the war raged, Elizabeth Morgan was doing her bit on the home front, working at the South Melbourne markets. On that fateful night in October 1917, she was headed home after a long and busy day. In the distance, she saw a figure in uniform, a young man she thought she recognised. As she got closer, the figure became clearer. It was her friend, Private Jack Thomas, standing under a street light right in front of the Morgan house.
Good night, Jack. When he didn't answer, she thought perhaps he hadn't heard her. But of course, my grandparents were in the front room and they heard her call out to him. When she entered her home, her father asked her who she'd been talking to.
Who was that you were talking to?
And she said, Jack Thomas.
Jack Thomas?
Jack Thomas is in France, dear, fighting at the front.
My mother said, well, perhaps he's home on leave. She said, I definitely saw him.
And for the moment, that was that. The next day, Elizabeth Morgan's encounter and Jack's mysterious silence were all but forgotten. It was a sunny spring afternoon, and the Morgans were making the most of it. When?
Liz? Would you like a cup of tea, Father?
Don't mind if I do.
The visit by the parish priest was unexpected. A visit that in those dark days could mean only one thing.
Terrible, terrible thing. Just got the news this morning.
What's happened, Father?
Father Callahan went to tell the Morgans of the tragic battle at Passchendaele, of the heroic struggle by Australian troops to take a strategic ridge, of the cable from military headquarters he'd received that morning. The cable that reported the death of their neighbour and friend, Jack Thomas.
What? Jack's dead.
Jack's body was never found. He's one of 6,000 Australians whose remains were never recovered from the battlefield of Passchendaele. He's one of the unknown soldiers that we remembered last November when we interred the unknown Australian soldier at the Australian War Memorial.
Good night, Jack.
So, how could Elizabeth Morgan have seen Jack Thomas that night? Maybe it wasn't Jack after all. Maybe she was mistaken. Maybe it was another young soldier home from leave.
The only Australians to return from the war during the war were men who were wounded. No Australians got leave to come home until the very end of the war.
Elizabeth could never explain her brief encounter. All she could ever say for sure was that she'd definitely seen young Jack. It wasn't her imagination. It wasn't a ghost. It was him in the flesh.
She was convinced that she had then seen his spirit return home, perhaps to try and comfort his family.
The news was a dreadful shock to Elizabeth Morgan. Someone so young, so close to the family, so much like her own sweetheart. Many, many more Australians would die in those last stages of the Great War. But never again would the parish priest visit the Morgan family home. Elizabeth's young man, Ernest, would make it home safely.
When my father came home, he proposed to my mother in a most unusual manner, told her he was going to marry her, and she said, "Oh, are you?" And he said, "Yes." He said, "I've already asked your mother," and she said, "It's all right." So.
And 3 weeks later, he did just that. Ernest and Elizabeth were married and, as they say in the fairy tales, lived happily ever after. But throughout her life, Elizabeth never forgot her encounter with Jack Thomas, the story that eventually she was able to relate to her own daughter, Pat.
She used to always say to us, "Never be afraid of the dead. They'll never hurt you. It's only the living that will hurt you."